Welcome to the Unlist. Today, I've got a doozy for you. We are talking about mass appeal. And no, I'm not going to be naming fragrances I think are mass appealing in this video. So if you're here for that, bye. Instead, we are covering the very concept of mass appeal itself. Why does the current perfume market seem so obsessed with it? Especially given that perfumes in the last 3 to 4 years alone have been very quickly, precipitously getting more expensive, more exclusive, and out of reach for more and more people. Fragrances are experiencing a reversal of market stature from where they were even 5 years ago, okay? Fragrances as a toiletry, as a grooming accessory, are basically done, at least from a high-end perfume standpoint. They are now moving back into being status signifiers, to being displays of wealth, to being something that you hold over someone else. You hope that when you walk out the door wearing your $500 bottle of Aventus, that people smell you and go, "That's Aventus. He's important. He's someone special." Or if you go out of your house wearing Delina or something by Parfum de Marly, and then some guy goes, "Okay, well, she's classy. She's got Delina on, so I don't have a chance with her. She's too good for me," right? That's what these fragrances are meant to communicate now, your station. They're not really so much just, "Oh, I have good grooming. Oh, I'm trying to attract some sexual attention." It's not that anymore. That's basic. That's what it was 20, 30 years ago. It's not that now. Now they are definitely they are very conspicuous displays of wealth, which, if you remember, I've mentioned in the past, Thorsten Veblen with his whole conspicuous consumption, the whole term Veblen goods, very, very important, because perfumes during his time were such Veblen goods. They were expensive just because. If you could afford to wear a perfume, you had means, you were significant, okay? So that changed with the industrialization of the perfume industry, with Coty, with Avon, all that stuff. Every drugstore, every five and dime, every grocery store had some form of perfume, and they were all of reasonable expectation of quality, okay? Whether you were wearing Avon or Chanel, they all had a very reasonable expectation. You were going to smell good. That began to slowly reverse itself in the 90s with the advent of niche brands like Creed getting a lot of popularity, L'Artisan Parfumeur, Diptyque, and then Frederic Malle, and then Le Labo, okay? All the niche brands broke out and made a higher tier. Because originally, that higher tier was Guerlain and Caron, right? Houbigant. But then they kind of merged down with designers. So then, this new upper crusty tier. And then all the drugstore perfumes, which, if any class of fragrance needed to be mass appealing, right? You with me here? Any class needed to be mass appealing, it was the drugstore fragrance. It was the five and dime fragrance. It was the Avon fragrance. It was the Machiavelli, the Schulten, the Dana, okay? Those were the fragrances that needed to be mass appealing because they were sold at a much lower margin and were expected to make volume in place. So with fragrances of a much higher volume and lower margin, you needed to make sure that the widest selection of person available would like that perfume. You had to make sure the perfume had a populist lean to it because it was expected to sell in large number. Well, brands like Chanel and Guerlain could afford to not do that. They could be unique. They could be special. They could be challenging. They could make a statement. They could be bold, okay? They could be artistic because the kind of person who was buying that perfume was only going to one of very few locations, usually in major cities, New York City, London, Tokyo, you get my point, Paris. And they had significant means to even know, because these brands didn't advertise that much until after the post-war years, after the television, 50s and 60s, magazines. But originally it was, if you know, you know. If you have to ask, right? You have to ask, then you're not meant to know. That's how it was treated, to keep the exclusivity, to keep the specialness. And then the prohibitively high price point would also follow suit with that, right? But it didn't matter, though. It didn't matter because you had all those common perfumes, all those drugstore things. That was the mass appeal stuff. All that stuff, you know, smelled pleasant and inoffensive, brute, inoffensive. So a lot of Coty perfumes back then, Jean 2, inoffensive. Everyone could get behind them. So that was the point. And then, of course, I feel like in terms of individuality and sex appeal, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s is where we kind of maximize that. And it's because of the generation, right? I don't want to get too much into history here, but when you think about it, the people who fought in World War II, the greatest generation, the ones that came home, started families, they couldn't really be afforded individual indulgence. They weren't really afforded an Epicurean lifestyle because they were busy working, raising kids, fighting wars, keeping the earth turning, right? But the baby boomers, the kids coming out of school, entering the workforce or going to college in the 60s, you know, Woodstock, all that stuff, growing their hair out, learning about Far East religions and stuff, listening to Beatles records, blacklight posters, Jimi Hendrix, you know, dropping acid. They could afford to be a little more indulgent, self-indulgent. They could afford to be a little more individualistic, to explore their sexuality, to explore their individual perspective on the human condition, you know, big stuff there, big concepts. So they would want perfumes that were bolder and more individualistic and stood out from a crowd. They did not want mass appeal. Mass appeal was the last thing boomers wanted in their perfumes at that time, at that age. And that would continue to be the status quo into the 70s, into the 80s, with all the big, heavy, bold, aldehyde fragrances and all the big sheeps and all the big leathers and animalic stuff. You know, everything was just trying to compete for attention. Everything louder than everything else. Just volume wars. You know, my perfume is more big and gregarious and outgoing and loquacious and, you know, volume maximized than your perfume. You know, they were getting banned from restaurants. You know, Poison got banned from restaurants. Giorgio got banned from restaurants. That was kind of, we reached like anti-mass appeal, like the peak, the very peak of anti-mass appeal. Fragrances couldn't get any less mass appealing if they tried back then. Couldn't get any less mass appealing if they tried. And then, of course, there was this giant pendulum swing, right? Into the 80s, late 80s, into the 90s, because then all the Gen Xers were coming up. And then the Gen Xers were followed by the millennials. And they didn't want the big, bold, obnoxious. They wanted to be quiet. They wanted to sit in their corner. They wanted to drink their coffee, get on their laptop, and enjoy their own personal space, right? Correct? They were more introverted. They were much more introverted. They also had no care for mass appeal. They didn't have a care for it because they wanted to be left alone. Those latchkey kids stayed home, used the microwave, cooked for themselves when the daddy was out working. They wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to get compliments from people. Millennials the same way. Didn't want to get compliments from people. They were busy working 2 jobs and trying to go to college at the same time because the economy was about to betray them and take all their opportunities away to own homes and stuff, right? Last thing they wanted was compliments from people. They didn't care. So they didn't want mass appeal. They wanted it to be, you know, inoffensive, yes. Inoffensive, yes. Pleasant, you know, staying in its own lane, right? Again, introverted, yes. Yes to all those things. Mass appealing? No. Not really. Not necessary. So, that leaves me with the question, who wants this and why? Who wants this and why? Well, here's the hot take part of the video. The real answer is nobody wants this. But they've been made to want this with the power of marketing and suggestion. The idea that your fragrance needs to garner compliments. The fact that your fragrance needs to be mass appealing or else there's something wrong with it, right? It's not doing its job if people don't notice how good you smell. That the fragrance itself is a weapon to use in your sexual conquest. Yeah, that's a bit of a harkening back to the 70s, but the difference between the 70s and now is the fragrances in the 70s that were all sexed up were like tongue-in-cheek. It was kind of humorous. It wasn't serious. Guys didn't go into buying a bottle of Jovan Musk thinking they were going to get laid every single day wearing it. But they thought that if they put it on, it might help a little bit, right? It might expedite the process some. But they didn't expect the Jovan Musk to do the heavy lifting for them. They knew that they needed a personality, a decent, stable income, and a place to live. They had to have something else besides the fragrance that would attract people to them. The fragrance couldn't be the Trojan horse, right? Wheeling out the Trojan horse and then climbing inside. That's the key difference. Today, you can be uglier than hitting every tree branch of the ugly tree on the way down. You can look like a hot mess and just kind of be like Sloth from the Goonies, right? Like this. But as long as you've got a mass appeal fragrance on, it's okay. You know, you can be like this, walking around like this, and it's okay. It's perfectly okay because you've got your mass appeal fragrance that makes it all right. You know, you can have breath that smells like, 3-day-old tuna and some garlic and some vanilla mixed together, but it's fine because you've got your mass appeal fragrance. Cover it all up. And they'd be more than happy to sell it to you for only $300. You can have the ultimate sex bomb that will get you everybody salivating and probably wetting their pants too. And you will be the Casanova. You'll be the Adonis, you know? Or if it's a lady, you'll be Aphrodite, okay? You'll be Venus for that price point. And it's kind of silly, you know? It's really silly. But what's even sillier though is the fact that even brands that don't have that particular marketing ploy, brands that aren't trying to really lay down the sex appeal, like, you know, generally brands like Chanel and Hermes don't really bank on sex appeal. They go for the whole aloof, classy, almost like a vampire, the whole aloof, classy, I'm over here being wealthy and important. I've got no time for you, right? All the Chanel ads are like, in the ads, Dior ads, like this, right? I have no time for you. I'm so important. I eat one pretzel stick a day, right? That's their whole thing. So the marketing doesn't line up. And then the placement doesn't line up because the fragrances get more and more expensive, more and more exclusive. Functionally speaking, we are going back to the late 19th century. We're going back to the early 20th. Functionally speaking, we have gone back to those Guerlains, those Carons, those Houbrigants. We've gone back to the nobles, kicking the pauper into the mud, going, I don't care what you think, right? I'm too important to care about you. Functionally, we've gone back to that with the perfume market. More expensive, more exclusive, even the basic Tom Fords being $200. People consider stuff like Baccarat Rouge 540 mainstream, when that's like a $300 fragrance minimum, you know, but that's mainstream. You know, people consider Parfum de Marly Layton another $350 fragrance. That's mainstream, right? But it's not mainstream because how many people are actually wearing that stuff? Unless you're like me and you live in Seattle or New York or Hollywood or, you know, the expensive parts of London, which arguably all of London is expensive now. Even the East End is expensive now. They chased all the pie and mash shops out and replaced them with artisanal gastropubs or whatever. Ask your British friends, they'll tell you. The whole working class thing is dead in London. It's gone. So the whole thing is that kind of person should by rights not want mass appeal. If you are that tech bro, that doctor, that lawyer, okay, you shouldn't want mass appeal because you don't want to deal with the hoi polloi. You don't want to deal with the proletariat. You don't. You are in your little cloud world, your little Aeon Flux bubble city, perfect white ivory tower city. You drive your Tesla. You eat your artisanal quinoa meals, and you're on your 80-inch OLED TV, all right? You've got your little ticker of CNN down at the bottom while you've got 4 different programs going at once because you've got ADHD and you're probably off your meds. That's okay. You're an overachiever. Doesn't matter. And you got all that going on in your life. And you have a personal shopper that goes out for you and buys all your food and brings it to you, or you've got Amazon Fresh. You don't go to a grocery store, okay? You're not amongst the people, all right? The most amongst the people you are is saying hello to the DoorDash driver. That's the most really human interaction you have at that point if you reach that station in life. So what use do you have for mass appeal? Who are you getting compliments from? You're working from home, because the office you used to work in closed after the pandemic. So you're working from home. You're probably living 300-400 miles away from the actual headquarters of your job now. So you're in some bed and breakfast town somewhere because you don't need to show up anymore to the office. So you're living like in the middle of Wyoming or something. You're living the dream out there in your $4 million house or whatever. You're not seeing people. So the obsession with the compliments, it's got to be the batch of Aventus. It's got to be the latest this, that, other. No, it doesn't. Because you're not interacting with other people. I mean, the reality check here is nightclubs are full of working class people that can barely afford to be there. Granted, they can barely afford to be there, but that's who's in the nightclubs. Because all the, wealthy, successful business folks left the cities. They're not in the nightclubs anymore. The nightclubs are even still open. A lot of them closed up. Just so you know, they're gone now. They're just empty storefronts. They're not full of these wealthy, successful, beautiful people like the Marilyn Manson song. The beautiful people have scattered like roaches. Gone. So if you're in that part of society where you can afford that $300 bottle of Parfum de Marly or that $225 bottle of Tom Ford, or you're someone who's really living outside your means, you're working 2 retail jobs and you're spending a third of your paycheck on a bottle of Tom Ford, I'd have a different question for you if that was the case. If you're that person, barely making ends meet and you're buying Tom Ford at retail, I'd have a question for you about what's going on, because I've been poor most of my life and I'm not buying Tom Ford. I mean, there was a point in time where you could get it discounted, right? But like I said, those days are over now. That stuff's gone now. FragranceNet wants $20 less than the counters do, so it's no point. It's pointless. It's still expensive. $20 discount on a $200 bottle is still $180 fucking dollars. So it's still a lot of money. So it's just, So there it is. That is the crux of my question. Mass appeal. It doesn't make sense now. That's a hot take. It is. I know it's a very hot take. But unless they come out with cheap perfumes again, unless Schulten rises from the dead, Spidel Textron rises from the dead, Coty decides to release actual Coty branded perfumes again, okay? Coty brings back Coty. I know that's a mind blower. Coty resurrects itself and puts those perfumes back on the shelves at $25, $30, $40 a bottle, whatever. There's just, the mass appeal thing doesn't equate. It doesn't balance out. The numbers don't add up, okay? And all the stuff like this, which is like $160 now for this, yeah, smell-wise, very mass appeal. This is a very mass appealing scent, but it's not a mass appeal price point. So the person who buys this at retail shouldn't give a rat's ass about what everyone else thinks how they smell, because they're not around those people. Not around them. All right, guys. That's been my video on mass appeal. Let me know what you think. See you next time.